Hi, everyone. It is 4 o'clock in the East. I'm Alex Wagner in for Nicole Wallace. Today, an unscripted President Biden drew a line in the sand over what he framed as decency versus cruelty on a continuing immigration crisis that has brought us some of the most wrenching stories and images of the last several years. Biden today unapologetically declaring compassion restored to the highest office in the land as a centerpiece of his policy on migration. An outcry over conditions at the southern border consuming Biden's long-awaited first formal press conference as president, one in which he had hoped to take a victory lap on his COVID response. Biden announced today before taking questions that he has doubled his vaccination goal to 200 million shots in his first 100 days in office. But not one question related to COVID was asked today by the reporters in the room, as a cascade of unforeseen tragedies rile this moment in Biden's presidency. Gun violence, racial injustice, and especially the border, which the White House insists is not a crisis at all. Biden addressing concerns of his critics that his more compassionate stance on unaccompanied minors and rollbacks in what his administration called the cruelest policies of the Trump administration, that was encouraging parents to send their children to the U.S. illegally, because Biden, the thinking goes, is such a good guy. And while Biden rejected that notion, calling a springtime migrant surge a seasonal problem, no worse under his administration than the one before it, he also refused to apologize for factoring humanity into his approach on children at the border.
The idea that I'm going to say, which I would never do, that if an unaccompanied child ends up at the border, we're just going to let him starve to death and stay on the other side. No previous administration did that either, except Trump. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. A 9-year-old, I'm going to send him on a 1,000-mile journey across the desert and up to the United States because I know Joe Biden's a nice guy and he'll take care of him. What a desperate act to have to take. The circumstances must be horrible. Rolling back the policies of separating children from their mothers, I make no apology for that. Rolling back the policies of remain in Mexico, sitting on the edge of the Rio Grande in a muddy circumstance with not enough to eat, I make no apologies for that. I make no apologies for ending programs that did not exist before Trump became president, that have an incredibly negative impact on the law, international law, as well as on human dignity. And so I make no apologies for that.
Not only did President Biden make a direct moral distinction between himself and the former guy, Biden also explicitly blamed him for implementing policies that worsened the border issue and intensified the problem, later dumped in Biden's lap.
By the way, does anybody suggest that there was a 31% increase under Trump because he was a nice guy? He dismantled all the elements that exist to deal with what had been a problem and has been continued to be a problem for a long time. He, in fact, shut down the number of beds available. He did not fund HHS to get people, to get the children out of those Border Patrol facilities where they should not be and not supposed to be more than a few days, a little while. But he dismantled all of that. And so what we're doing now is attempting to rebuild the system that can accommodate what is happening today. And I'd like to think it's because I'm a nice guy, but it's not. It's because of what's happened every year. So we're building back up the capacity that should have been maintained and built upon, that Trump dismantled. It's going to take time.
Joe Biden's defiance against politics of cruelty at the border is where we start today. New York Times White House reporter and MSNBC contributor Annie Carney is here. Also with us, political strategist and founder of Country Over Party, Matthew Dowd. And Jason Johnson is here. He is a professor of politics and journalism at Morgan State University, a contributor to the Griot, and an MSNBC political contributor. Annie, let me start with you. There was a fair amount of anticipation and probably no small amount of trepidation on the part of some White House staff about this first presidential press conference for Joe Biden. On the trickiest issue by far, the border, he was unapologetic and he spoke from the heart. How did you assess his performance?
He did. And I think the biggest I think overall, look, he did little to fuel the narrative on the right that there is something wrong with his mental acuity. He spoke at length for over an hour on foreign policy, on immigration, on guns, on the filibuster, and he showed, that he can speak unscripted and not make huge gaffes. So I think on that front, it was a win. I don't think this White House intended to spend so much time on immigration, to spend no questions about the coronavirus. And I saw, in the aftermath of the press conference, White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain retweeting criticism of the press for not focusing on the issue that's most important to most American people. I've talked to White House advisors who think the border issue obviously is a huge problem. It's one they need to address, but they don't think that this is what's keeping most Americans up at night. So I think that overall, Biden's performance is probably pleasing his advisors. The subject matter that dominated was not necessarily what they had hoped would be the focus of this first news conference.
Matthew, it's hard to be defiantly compassionate, but that's kind of the way it felt today when you listened to Biden at the podium.
I mean, absolutely. Everybody knows, even as people that oppose him knows he's a completely empathetic person, and he knows he has great care and compassion for the rest of humanity. But I thought he did that in a very good way. I mean, obviously, he's trying to clean up a mess that was created before him. And when you clean up a mess, the first thing you do is you have to go through and see what the mess is. And when you see what the mess is and try to deal with it, then people sort of quickly want to go, why aren't you dealing with the mess in a much faster fashion? So I thought he spoke about it. I think that the people coming here know that there is much more of an idea that there's going to be a receptive government that's more compassionate than there was the last 4 years. So in that way, I think he exuded it. But I'm going to emphasize a point made sooner. I don't think a lot of these questions were questions the American public, if they were seated in that room, would have asked. I think there would have been at least one question, if not multiple questions about COVID. There would have been questions about the economy. And I don't think anybody would have asked the question about whether or not he was going to run for re-election. So yes, it was dominated by immigration. I thought he handled it well, but I don't think it was dominated by the questions the American public have.
Yeah, you could sense a certain level of frustration in some of those answers. I want to play one exchange with Caitlin Collins. The president clearly frustrated, I think, at the sort of basic nature of the question. Let's play that exchange.
The Customs and Border Protection facility in Donna, Texas, I was there, is at 1,556% capacity.
Yep.
Is what's happening inside acceptable to you? And when is this going to be fixed?
That's a serious question, right? Is it acceptable to me? Come on. That's why we're going to be moving 1,000 of those kids out quickly. That's why I got Fort Bliss opened up. That's why I've been working from the moment this started to happen to try to find additional access for children to be able to safely, not just children, but particularly children, to be able to safely be housed while we follow through on the rest of what's happening. That is totally unacceptable.
Jason, I feel like it's a very effective response, right? Of course, this isn't acceptable to me. Not only does it give you insight into Joe Biden's, understanding of the situation, it is also a very sharp contrast with the words of his predecessor, and we'll play those in a second. What did you make of it?
I mean, he could have thrown in malarkey and dog-faced pony soldier. It was very Joe Biden, right? It was very folksy Joe Biden, like, why are we even having these kinds of questions? But I want to sort of go along with what other people have said. So I actually watched this press conference with my students on Zoom at Morgan State University, and I had to explain to them why talking about immigration was such a big deal, because they're not thinking about that. Because a bunch of 19, 20, 21-year-olds, some of whom are going to be graduating this year, who are thinking about going out into this economy, who are wondering if school's going to be open this fall, they want to know about stimulus checks. They want to know about COVID. So I think Joe Biden did really well with what he was given, right? He was an actor who got a somewhat mediocre script, and he knocked it out of the park. But I think that the questioning sometimes was based on the current news cycle and not what he's actually been doing so far. I was wondering questions about judges. Why weren't there more questions about the filibuster? I mean, you know, Biden sort of wiggled on that one. I think those issues would have been much more relevant. We would have gotten much more out of the press conference if those kind of questions would ask us. That's what my group of 20-something students was thinking about when they watched it with me.
Well, Annie, I mean, I think if the Biden administration is listening to what Jason's saying, they will be delighted because they, I don't think, particularly want to be talking about the border situation. They would much rather be talking about COVID, a plan for reopening schools, and mass vaccinations.
I think they'd also be happy that the controversy being discussed in the immediate aftermath of the press conference is what questions were asked, not some gaffe that he made. I think that would probably be considered a win for this president. I do have to say that I understand. I would defend some questions about whether he'll seek re-election. This, you know, he's the oldest president to sit in office. It is an overarching question. It depends. It determines how he governs, how long he has to push through major ambitious policies he want to have. Does he have 2 years? Does he have 4 years? Does he have 8 years? And so I think I think that I would defend that question as relevant, even if it doesn't seem like it's about shots and checks, which I agree is the main concern of the American people right now. I think it's important and relevant to how he can govern.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, if we talk about, without being too navel-gazing, Matthew, you know, if we talk about why the press is focused on one narrative versus the other, there is more to mine in the way of controversy. And it must be said, previous presidential press conferences had a lot of controversy in them, right? I mean, this is the first one of the new era. And I think you are seeing a learning curve here. This administration has not been as dramatic as the last one. And I think that there's a hangover on that front as far as the press's ability to navigate that.
Well, I think that's probably very true. They're not used to substance. The press has spent 4 years in playing a game where they were either they're getting called names or figuring out what names Donald Trump was going to call somebody and having to deal with like the substantive part of the issue. But I'll just push back on this, and having been involved in politics and also on the media side of this. I think it's a valid question after a midterm. I don't think it's a question in the first 100 days with all of the controversies and everything going around. People can ask whatever question they want, and a president has to be able to deal with it. But there's no other answer this president was going to give anyway. He wasn't going to announce in his first 100 days, 3.5 years left in his term or more, that he was not going to run for re-election. That was not going to happen. You can't do that. And so it's my view the press has to go back. I mean, I thought him asking the first question to the Associated Press reporter was so important because it was like, oh, we're back to normal. The first question goes to the AP reporter, just like we did in previous press conferences. And so I think they're going to get used to that in the course of this. I do think the press, who mainly occupy Washington, D.C., and mainly occupy the debate that goes on Capitol Hill, has to get out more of that bubble, because the debate and the conversation that's going on in Capitol Hill is not the conversation a lot of times that's going on in households around America.
Jason, I do think it's important to the issue that was central in this press conference, to contrast the styles and the responses, the morality that was on display in the last season of presidential politics and in this season of presidential politics. This is President Trump in 2018 talking about migrant children at the border.
We have the worst immigration laws of any country anywhere in the world. But they exploited the loopholes in our laws to enter the country as unaccompanied alien minors. They look so innocent. They're not innocent.
You know, they look so innocent, they're not innocent. That just brings to the fore, I think, what was the governing thesis of the Trump administration. A brilliant article in The Atlantic written by Adam Serwer, "The cruelty is the point." It seems to me that if you listen to everything that Joe Biden has said since the inauguration, the alternate version of that for the Biden administration is the compassion is the point.
Right. And Alex, it's also common sense. I thought Joe Biden's answer, he's like, look, part of why people come up here is if things are screwed up in their home countries. Well, you know, how about rather than us sending millions of dollars or doing some sort of extravention, we put up street lights in difficult cities, right? We provide resources for transportation. I thought he had a very practical answer. Immigration is a very, very complex issue that usually is only discussed in American politics in terms of sort of racial rhetoric or questions about voting behavior when it's really an economics issue. And I thought he did a good job of answering an economics question and also being moral about it. But I'll also say this, and I think it's important because of the context in which it was discussed. I don't know if immigration is like seasonal affective disorder or allergies. It comes winter or spring. I don't know that, right? I'm not an expert on demography. But I do know this. It is reasonable to assume that when you have a president who bases his entire campaign on morality and decency, while I don't necessarily think that there was, as the reporter asked, while I don't necessarily think mothers are sitting around the table in El Salvador saying, Joe Biden's a nice guy, go up there, I do think the fact that he is running a competent administration that's not based on cruelty, that's not based on white nationalism, would allow people who are interested in asylum to maybe risk it under him in a way that they wouldn't before. But that's not something he should be criticized for. It's something he should be praised for.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there is this sort of the desire on the part of this administration and this president to be compassionate, to be common sense, to be healing. And then there is the reality of American politics right now. And I know we've been talking about the filibuster. We've been sort of playing footsie with that topic, and we'll have more on that later on in the show. There is the fact of the matter that this desire to be in the middle, to be a consensus builder, to be a healer, to not, increase the temperature of a very, very hot political landscape. The reality is we're barreling towards a reckoning, Matthew. We're barreling towards a reckoning because of the reality of where the Republican Party is at in terms of lawmaking and legislation.
Well, exactly, Alex. Joe Biden has dropped into a situation where what the Republicans are representing in Washington, D.C. is completely out of step with where the majority of America are. A perfect example is 75% of the country supports raising the minimum wage. 75% of the country is for making voting easier, and 75% of the country wants something done on gun reform, none of which the Republicans are allowing to do. And so Joe Biden has built already a consensus abroad across America of Democrats, independents, and some Republicans. He just doesn't have that consensus in Washington because of the obstructionism of the Republicans. And the filibuster is you're going to talk about that later, but the filibuster is center of that problem. So he has walked into a dysfunctional system because the Republican Party no longer wants to appeal to a majority of America.
Annie, the president made an allusion to polling numbers in this press conference. And they clearly believe, to Matthew's point, that they have the goodwill and the support of the American people, the American voter, regardless of party. The numbers are high enough that they can continue on this tack. I mean, I guess I wonder how long we think that can happen, how long we think the numbers can stay where they are, that he can stoke the goodwill of the people. Infrastructure has widespread support. It is not necessarily a controversial topic, though the Republican Party may seek to make it so in terms of its price tag in the coming weeks. I mean, what do you make of that strategy?
Well, I think this is the big question. I've heard Biden advisors say we need to redefine what bipartisan means, because bipartisan exists, just not in Congress, where Republican lawmakers seem out of step with their own constituents. That being said, these proposals require votes in Congress, and it remains to be seen how he will push through a big infrastructure package, whether he can get everything he needs to get done through reconciliation. But we saw also today reality at play. Another issue that I was surprised to see didn't get that much attention days after another mass shooting was, what's he going to do on gun legislation? And his answer was probably depressing to gun safety advocates, but it was honest. Basically, it was, this is not at all a priority right now because we can't get anything done. I mean, his answer to a question about what are you doing on guns was a long-winded answer that we're doing infrastructure. So, I mean, it was clear he knows what Congress he's working with, and he's realistic about what is possible. But yeah, I mean, the big overarching political question is when what bipartisan means across the country will catch up with Republican lawmakers who get elected to represent the country.
That is the $3 trillion question. Annie Carney, Matthew Dowd, and Jason Johnson, thank you all for starting us off.